You know what's strange? I can still smell the ink from the banners we painted that spring. 20-something years later, and that smell, cheap paint on bed sheets, it's burned into my memory forever. My name is Chen Wei. Well, that's not my real name, but you'll understand why I can't use it by the end of this video. In 1989, I was a 21-year-old journalism student at Beijing University, and I was there. I was in Tiananmen Square during those 7 weeks that the world couldn't look away from China. This is my story, and I need to tell it before the details fade, before the memories become just another footnote in history books that some countries don't even allow their citizens to read. So if you're ready, let's go back. Back to Beijing. Back to 1989. Back to when we actually believed we could change everything. Picture Beijing in early 1989. If you've only seen images of modern China, gleaming skyscrapers, bullet trains, tech everywhere, you need to forget all that. The Beijing I knew was different. Grayer, quieter, more cautious. We rode bicycles everywhere, millions of them like rivers of black metal flowing through streets that were only just beginning to see private cars. The air already had that thick quality, but back then it was mostly from coal heating, not quite the industrial smog that would come later. I lived in a dormitory with 7 other guys. 7. In a room designed for maybe 4 people. We had 2 sets of bunk beds stacked along the walls, a communal desk in the middle, and exactly 1 power outlet that we had to share. You learn to be efficient. You learn to keep your important thoughts to yourself. Because here's what you need to understand about China in the 1980s. Things had been opening up, slowly, carefully. After the chaos of the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, when intellectuals were persecuted, when universities were shut down, when children were encouraged to denounce their own parents, there was this feeling that maybe, just maybe, we were moving towards something better. Deng Xiaoping had introduced economic reforms. People could start small businesses. Some Western music was filtering in. We could watch some foreign films. We even had students who'd gone abroad and come back with stories of places where people could say what they thought without looking over their shoulders. It felt like a door that had been locked for decades was opening. Just a crack. Just enough to let in a sliver of light. But here's the thing about doors that are only slightly open. You're never sure if they're opening wider or about to slam shut. April 15th, 1989. That's the date everything changed. I was in the library, probably avoiding an essay I should have been writing, when one of my roommates burst in. His face was pale. "Hu Yaobang is dead," he said. Now, if you're not familiar with Chinese politics, let me tell you about Hu Yaobang. He was a Communist Party leader who'd been sympathetic to reform, to openness, to the idea that maybe China could have both economic development and political freedom. In 1987, he was forced to resign after student protests. The hardliners in the party blamed him for being too soft, too liberal. And now he was dead. Heart attack. He was 73. You might wonder why the death of a disgraced politician would matter so much. But in China, political mourning is never just about mourning. It's one of the only ways to express dissatisfaction with the current government. You're not criticizing the living leaders. Oh no, that would be dangerous. You're just showing respect for the dead one. See the difference? It's a loophole. A tiny space where you can say, "We wish things were different," without quite saying it out loud. Within days, students started gathering in Tiananmen Square to lay wreaths for Hu Yaobang. Small groups at first, tentative, testing the waters. I went on the 3rd day. I remember standing at the edge of the square, looking at the monument to the people's heroes where students were placing flowers and banners. My heart was pounding. This felt dangerous. This felt important. This felt like standing at the edge of something you couldn't quite name. "Are you going closer?" my friend Lee asked. He was a physics student, usually the cautious type. I looked at him. He looked at me. We We went closer. Here's how quickly things can change. 1 week. That's all it took for memorial gatherings to become a full-blown protest movement. The square started filling up. Dozens of students became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. We came from all the universities in Beijing, Beijing University, Tsinghua University, People's University. We came with banners. We came with demands. And what were those demands? Were we calling for the overthrow of the Communist Party? Were we trying to start a revolution? No. God, no. We wanted dialogue. We wanted the government to acknowledge corruption in the party. We wanted freedom of the press. We wanted the right to form student unions independent of government control. We wanted to be treated like citizens with voices that mattered, not children to be managed. Reasonable things, we thought. Basic things. I remember the first time I spent an entire night in the square. It was late April. The weather was getting warmer, perfect for outdoor gatherings. Someone had brought a guitar. Someone else had smuggled out a portable cassette player from their dorm. We sat in groups, talking until 3, 4 in the morning about the kind of country we wanted China to become. Democracy with Chinese characteristics, someone said, trying to echo Deng Xiaoping's phrase about socialism with Chinese characteristics. We all laughed, but there was an edge to it. We were trying to frame our demands in language the government might accept. We were so naive. The energy in those early days, I don't know how to describe it to you. Have you ever been part of something that felt bigger than yourself? Where you looked around and realized you weren't alone in what you'd been thinking quietly for years? There were students giving speeches on the steps of the monument. Their voices would crack from hours of talking, but they kept going. There were art students painting massive banners with slogans about freedom and transparency. There were literature students writing poems and manifestos that got passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied until the words were barely legible. My journalism professor, I won't name him, pulled me aside one day in late April. We were supposed to be discussing my thesis topic. "Chen Wei," he said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was in earshot. "Be careful." "I'm being careful, Professor." "No," he shook his head. "You think you are, but I was young once too. I was young in the 60s. I know what happens when idealism meets reality in this country." I thanked him. I didn't listen. Why would I? Everything felt possible then. By early May, the protests had been going for 3 weeks. The government was issuing stern warnings in the People's Daily, the official newspaper. They called us troublemakers. They said we were being manipulated by foreign forces. They said we didn't understand the stability and progress China had achieved. But they hadn't shut us down. Not yet. Then some of the student leaders proposed something radical, a hunger strike. The announcement came on May 13th. Hundreds of students declared they would stop eating until the government agreed to dialogue, until they stopped calling us troublemakers and acknowledged we were patriots who loved our country. I wasn't one of the hunger strikers. I wish I could tell you I was brave enough, but I wasn't. My role became supporting them, bringing water, helping set up medical tents, coordinating with other students to make sure the hunger strikers were monitored for safety. But I watched them. These kids, and some were just kids, 18, 19 years old, sitting in the Beijing sun with white headbands that said things like, "Give me democracy" or "Give me death," their lips cracking, their eyes growing hollow after days without food. There was this one girl, probably a freshman. I never learned her name. She was so tiny, couldn't have weighed more than 45 kilos. On the 3rd day of the hunger strike, I watched her try to stand up and immediately collapse. 2 of her friends caught her before she hit the ground. "Please eat something," one of them begged. "Just a little." She shook her head weakly. "Not until they listen." They carried her to the medical tent. I don't know what happened to her after that. The hunger strike changed everything. Suddenly, we weren't just students making noise. We were students willing to die for what we believed in. And that got attention. Here's something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. We weren't just a local story anymore. We were the story. Foreign journalists had descended on Beijing. CNN, BBC, Japanese networks, newspapers from around the world. And here's the beautiful irony. They were already in Beijing for another reason. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, was making a historic state visit. The Chinese government had planned this big, carefully orchestrated event to show China's growing importance on the world stage. Instead, all the international cameras were pointing at us. I remember seeing the satellite trucks parked around the square, these massive vehicles with dishes on top beaming our images to the entire world. Western journalists with their professional cameras interviewing students in broken Mandarin. Some of us had studied enough English to communicate. We became impromptu translators, trying to explain to the world what we wanted, why we were there. "Do you think you can succeed?" a British journalist asked me one afternoon. He was young, maybe only a few years older than me, with red hair that seemed impossible under the Beijing sun. "We have to believe we can," I told him. "What's the alternative? Going back to silence?" He nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "The whole world is watching you, you know. What you're doing here, it's inspiring people everywhere." The whole world was watching. That phrase started circulating among us, giving us confidence. Surely the government wouldn't crack down on us with all these foreign cameras recording everything. Surely international pressure would force them to negotiate. Surely, surely, surely. We believed in the power of witnesses. We thought being seen meant being protected. On May 30th, art students from the Central Academy of Fine Arts unveiled something that would become one of the most iconic images of the protests, the goddess of democracy. It was a 10-meter-tall statue made of foam and papier-mâché over a metal frame. She stood facing the giant portrait of Mao Zedong that hangs on the Tiananmen Gate, holding a torch in both hands above her head. Yes, she was obviously inspired by the Statue of Liberty. We knew that. The government definitely knew that. But she was also different. More Asian features, wearing robes instead of that classical Western style, and holding the torch with both hands, as if offering it, sharing it, rather than just holding it aloft. When they unveiled her, thousands of us cheered. We took turns standing guard around her, protecting her. She became our symbol, our rallying point, our statement that we wanted the kind of freedoms that torch represented. I have this memory that's burned into my brain. Standing in front of that statue at sunset, the white foam painted to look like marble turning golden in the fading light, and feeling like we'd already won. Like the statue itself was proof that we'd changed something fundamental, that you couldn't put this desire for freedom back in the box. My friend Lee, remember him, the physics student, stood next to me that evening. "They'll have to negotiate now," he said. "Look at all this. They can't just pretend we don't exist." "When do you think they'll talk to us?" I asked. He shrugged. "Soon. Has to be soon." We were running out of soon. It's important to tell you that we weren't unified. That's something that gets lost in the historical accounts sometimes. We're remembered as this singular movement, but the reality was messier. There were debates, constant debates, about tactics, about demands, about whether we should negotiate or hold firm, about whether we should clear the square or stay forever if necessary. Some student leaders wanted to declare victory and go back to classes. We'd made our point, they argued. The government knew we were serious. We should leave while we were ahead. Others said that was surrender. We hadn't achieved any of our actual goals. No concrete reforms had been announced. Leaving now would mean it had all been for nothing. There were also tensions between the students and workers who'd started joining us. The workers wanted to talk about economic issues, inflation, corruption, the growing gap between the rich and poor. Some students worried that was too radical, that we needed to keep the focus narrow. I sat in on one of these meetings in late May. It was in a tent in the square, maybe 30 of us crowded together, everyone talking over each other. "We need to be strategic," one student leader kept saying. If we push too hard, they'll have an excuse to crack down. They'll crack down anyway, a worker shot back. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with calloused hands that said he'd done real labor his whole life. You students don't understand. The party doesn't negotiate. The party waits until you're weak, and then it crushes you. Silence after that. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. Then what do you suggest? Someone finally asked. The worker lit a cigarette. I suggest we stop pretending this ends peacefully. More silence. We didn't want to hear that. We couldn't afford to hear that. Because if he was right, then everything we'd been doing, the speeches, the hunger strikes, the goddess of democracy, all of it was just theater before the inevitable. On May 20th, the government declared martial law in Beijing. Let that sink in. Martial law in the capital city. They were bringing in the military. But here's what happened. The people of Beijing stopped them, ordinary citizens, factory workers, shopkeepers, teachers, parents. They blocked the roads leading into the city. They surrounded military convoys and pleaded with the soldiers not to move against us. They brought them food and water and asked them, "Are you really going to hurt your own people, your brothers and sisters?" Some soldiers looked confused. Some looked ashamed. The convoys stopped. For a few days, it felt like we'd won again. The people had spoken. The citizens of Beijing had protected us. The military couldn't move. Surely this meant the government would have to negotiate. But then the student movement made a decision that I still think about, even now. We voted to stay in the square, despite martial law, despite everything. I remember the vote. I raised my hand to stay. I watched hands go up all around me, hundreds of them, thousands. Why did we vote to stay? Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. The belief that leaving would mean the government had won. The feeling that we'd come too far to back down now. Or maybe, and this is the part that hurts, maybe we were just kids who'd been the center of world attention for 6 weeks and couldn't imagine it ending. Maybe we were addicted to the feeling of mattering. I don't know. I honestly don't know. Early June. The atmosphere in the square had changed. The celebration was gone. In its place, tension, fear, exhaustion. Most of the students had gone home. Exams were coming up. Families were calling, begging their children to come back. The hunger strikers had been convinced to start eating again after doctors warned that people would start dying. But a few thousand of us stayed, the hardcore believers, the ones who'd staked too much to leave, the ones who truly thought our presence in the square was the only thing standing between China and a return to complete repression. We heard rumors, constantly, conflicting rumors. The government was going to negotiate. No, they were bringing in troops from other provinces, soldiers who wouldn't feel sympathetic to Beijing students. No, there was a split in the leadership. Some leaders wanted dialogue. No, hardliners had won. They were planning to clear the square by force. Every rumor sent waves of anxiety through us. We didn't know what to believe. We didn't have the internet, remember? No smartphones. No way to verify anything quickly. Just word of mouth. And which rumors you chose to trust? I called my parents on June 2nd. There was a payphone on the edge of the square. I waited in line for 40 minutes to use it. Chen Wei. My mother's voice was tight with worry. Where are you? I'm okay, Ma. I'm safe. Come home. Please. Whatever you're doing, it's not worth your life. I'm not in danger. I promise. The lie tasted bitter. I already knew it was a lie. Your father wants to talk to you. My father got on the line. He was a quiet man, an engineer, someone who'd learned during the Cultural Revolution to keep his head down and his opinions to himself. Son, he said simply, please. That was all. Just please. But I heard everything in that word, all his fear, all his love, all his memories of what happened to people who stood up in China. I'll be home soon, Ba, I told him. I promise. A few more days. Another lie. The day started normal. Well, as normal as anything was in those days. Overcast sky, humid. The square was less crowded than it had been in weeks. Maybe 2,000 or 3,000 of us left. We heard the announcement around 6 p.m. Government loudspeakers placed around the city, broadcasting the same message on repeat. Citizens of Beijing, martial law is in effect. Clear the square immediately. Anyone remaining will face consequences. This is your final warning. They'd been saying versions of this for days. We'd stopped paying attention. Then, around 10 p.m., we heard something different. A sound that didn't belong in a city center. A rhythmic thumping, mechanical, powerful, tanks. I was on the western edge of the square when I saw the first one. It rolled down Chang'an Avenue, this massive metal beast that made the ground shake. Then another, and another. Behind them, trucks filled with soldiers. The strangest thing, how quiet we got. All the chanting and singing that had filled the square for weeks, it just stopped. We stood there, watching an army arrive to face us. "They're just trying to scare us," someone said. But their voice shook. The soldiers started forming lines. I remember noticing they were young. Some of them looked younger than me. They had their rifles, but they weren't pointing them at us. Not yet. A group of student leaders rushed to negotiate. They went right up to the military commanders, trying to talk. I was too far away to hear the conversation, but I could see the body language, the students pleading, the officers shaking their heads, the students becoming more desperate. Then we heard it. Gunfire. Pop, pop, pop. In the distance at first, from the western approaches to the square, then closer. Pop, 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 pop. "Those aren't real bullets," someone said. "They're rubber bullets. Blanks. They're just trying to scare us." But people started running toward us from the streets surrounding the square. People with blood on their clothes. People carrying wounded friends. People screaming. A guy around my age stumbled into the square, his shirt soaked red. He collapsed about 10 meters from where I stood. "They're shooting," he gasped. "They're actually shooting people." The soldiers were advancing now, moving into the square in formation. Some students linked arms, forming human chains. Some threw rocks and bottles. Most of us just stood there, frozen, unable to process what was happening. I need to slow down here. I need to tell this part carefully, because it gets confused in my memory. Fear does that. Trauma does that. 20-something years does that. The square descended into chaos. Tear gas canisters were fired into the crowds, spinning across the ground like deadly tops, spewing white smoke. People were coughing, crying, stumbling blind. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, but it didn't help much. The sound of gunfire was constant now, not just warning shots, not rubber bullets, the real thing, and people were falling. I saw a girl, couldn't have been more than 19, take a bullet in the leg. She went down screaming. Her friends dragged her toward one of the medical tents, but I don't know if she made it. Everything was moving too fast, too much happening at once. The goddess of democracy statue was still standing, this white figure in the middle of the madness. Some students had gathered around it, refusing to move, like it could protect them. It couldn't. The tanks rolled into the square, the actual square where we'd been living for 7 weeks, where we'd sung and debated and dreamed. Tanks. I watched one of them roll right over tents. Just crushed them flat like they were nothing, like the people who might have been inside them were nothing. "We have to go." Lee grabbed my arm. Blood was running down his face from a cut on his forehead. I don't know how he got it. "Chen Wei, we have to go now." But I couldn't move. I was staring at the statue, at the students around it, at the soldiers advancing. Then I heard the sound of metal grinding against stone and foam. One of the tanks had reached the goddess of democracy. It pushed against her slowly at first, almost experimentally. She tilted. Students scattered from around her base. She fell. Our goddess our symbol, our beautiful, impossible dream. She fell and shattered into pieces of painted foam and wire. That's when I ran. Lee and I ran west, away from the square, joining a flood of other students and citizens all fleeing the same way. Behind us, more gunfire, more screaming, more chaos. The streets were lit by burning vehicles. I don't know who set them on fire or why. Soldiers, students, angry citizens. Everything was smoke and confusion. We ran for blocks, our lungs burning. Every time we heard the sound of military trucks, we'd duck into an alley or a doorway. Once, we hid in a residential courtyard while a convoy of trucks passed. I could see soldiers in the back holding their rifles. Their faces were blank, following orders. An old woman came out of her house and saw us huddled by her wall. I thought she'd shout at us, turn us in. Instead, she just shook her head sadly and went back inside. A moment later, she returned with 2 bottles of water. "Go," she whispered. "Get away from here. Fast." We made it back to the university around 4 a.m. The campus was dark, quiet. It felt like a different planet from what we'd just experienced. Our dorm room was exactly as we'd left it. Someone's textbook still open on the desk. A jacket hanging on a hook. The ordinary debris of ordinary student lives. Lee and I just sat on our bunks, not speaking for a long time. His roommates weren't there. Mine weren't either. We didn't know where they were. As the sun came up, we heard helicopters overhead. The sound made us both jump. "What do we do?" Lee asked. I didn't have an answer. The next days were a blur of fear and confusion. The university was locked down. Soldiers patrolled the campus. We were told to stay in our dormitories. The government controlled all the media, of course. The official story appeared immediately. A counter-revolutionary riot had been put down. Soldiers had heroically defended the nation against violent criminals. A few hundred rioters had died. Order was restored. A few hundred. That was their number. We knew it was wrong. We'd seen too much. But we couldn't say anything. We couldn't prove anything. We couldn't even talk to each other safely. Students started disappearing. Not everyone. They were strategic about it. Student leaders, the ones who'd given speeches, the ones who'd been photographed, the ones whose names the government had collected. One morning, Lee's bed was empty. His belongings were gone. It was like he'd never existed. I never found out what happened to him. I've looked over the years, searched for his name. Nothing. He's a ghost now. They came for me on June 12th. Not to arrest me. I hadn't been important enough for that. But 2 men in plain clothes showed up at my dorm room. "Chen Wei, we need to ask you some questions." They took me to an office on campus, made me sit across from them at a metal desk, asked me the same questions over and over for 6 hours. Where were you on June 3rd and 4th? Who organized the protests? Who are the ringleaders? What contact did you have with foreign journalists? Did you receive money from foreign organizations? I gave them nothing. I said I'd been at the square, but only as an observer. I said I didn't know any organizers. I said I'd gone home early on June 3rd and hadn't seen the clearing of the square. Lies upon lies upon lies. They didn't believe me, but they also didn't have enough to do anything, so they gave me a warning instead. "You have a promising future ahead of you, Chen Wei," one of them said as they released me. "It would be a shame to throw it away over a moment of youthful foolishness. Do you understand?" I understood. The message was clear. Stay silent, and you get to keep your life. Speak, and you lose everything. I graduated in 1990. I became a journalist, ironically, working for a state-run newspaper. I wrote bland articles about agricultural reforms and factory production quotas. I never wrote about what happened in 1989. I got married, had a daughter, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But June 4th became this shadow that followed me. Every year as the anniversary approached, there was this weight on my chest. Every year, I'd remember the sound of gunfire, the smell of tear gas, the sight of the goddess of democracy falling. I couldn't talk about it with anyone. Not my wife, though she knew I'd been there. Not my daughter, who grew up not knowing this part of history. Not my colleagues, who'd learned the same lessons I had about survival. In China, you learn to live with what you can't say. You learn to keep memories locked inside. You learn to use clever metaphors online, calling June 4th, May 35th to get around censors, referencing it obliquely in ways the algorithms can't quite catch, but people understand. The government's line is consistent. It didn't happen the way you remember. It was necessary. It brought stability. Look at how China has developed since then. Look at how prosperous we've become. Was it worth destabilizing all that for some student protest? And you know what's really insidious? After 20-something years of economic growth, of China becoming a global superpower, a lot of people believe that. Younger Chinese citizens sometimes look at the historical accounts and think, maybe the government was right. Maybe stability was more important. That's what time and propaganda do. They make people forget. They make people doubt their own memories. They make people believe that the comfortable present justifies any past. I'm not in China anymore. I'm not going to tell you where I am, but it's somewhere I can finally speak without that weight on my chest. My daughter is an adult now. She asked me about Tiananmen Square a few years ago. She'd heard about it from a friend who'd studied abroad. She wanted to know if I'd been there, and I told her everything. I watched her face as I talked. I watched her trying to reconcile the father she knew, the careful, quiet man who'd always told her to be cautious, to not make waves, with this young man who'd believed he could change the world. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked when I finished. "Because I was afraid," I admitted. "I'm still afraid. But you deserve to know. The world deserves to remember. That's why I'm making this video. That's why I'm telling this story, even though using my real name could put family members still in China at risk. Even though it means I can probably never go home. Because here's what I learned. Governments can control the present, but they can't erase the past if people keep telling the stories. They can delete posts and ban words and rewrite history books, but they can't reach into people's minds and rip out the memories. I was there. I saw it. And before I die, I need people to know what really happened in Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989. Let me be clear about some things, because there's been a lot of misinformation over the years from both sides. Did students die in Tiananmen Square itself? The Chinese government says no, and technically, they might be right about that narrow claim. Most of the deaths happened on the approach streets, Chang'an Avenue, Muxidi, other areas around the square. But does that matter? Does it change anything that people were killed in the streets surrounding the square rather than in the square proper? They were still killed for the same reason, for demanding rights that should have been theirs all along. How many died? The Chinese government says a few hundred. Western estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. The truth is, we don't know exactly. Bodies were removed quickly. Families were pressured to cremate their loved ones immediately. Records were destroyed or classified. I can't give you a precise death toll. What I can tell you is that I saw people die. I saw blood on the streets. I saw bodies being carried away. Whether it was 300 or 3,000, each one was a person. Each one had a family. Each one had believed in something enough to risk everything. Were we perfect? No. We were disorganized. We were sometimes naive. We made tactical mistakes. Some of us were more interested in being student leaders than in actually leading. Some of our demands were vague or contradictory. But we were 20-year-olds trying to make our country better. We were kids who'd grown up in a system that told us to never question authority, who'd been raised by parents scarred by the Cultural Revolution, who'd been taught that the party knew best, and we still found the courage to stand in that square and say, no, we deserve better. Our country deserves better. That's what I want you to remember, not just the tragedy of how it ended, but the courage of why it started. People sometimes ask me, was it worth it? Would I do it again, knowing how it ended? Knowing about the crackdown, the deaths, the arrests, the decades of silence, the fact that China is arguably more authoritarian now than it was in 1989. I don't know how to answer that. On bad days, I think about all the people who died for nothing. I think about Lee, who probably spent years in a labor camp, or prison if he's lucky, who might be dead if he's not. I think about my own life, how I spent decades looking over my shoulder, how I missed out on normal conversations about my own history. I think about China now, the surveillance cameras on every corner, the social credit system, the great firewall that keeps people from seeing uncensored information, the camps in Xinjiang, the crackdown in Hong Kong. And I think we failed. We changed nothing. We just made the government more paranoid and more effective at control. But then I have good days. Days when I remember what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself. Days when I think about the fact that millions of Chinese people, even just for 7 weeks, believed they could have a voice in their own government. Days when I remember that the whole world watched and saw that Chinese people wanted freedom just like everyone else. I think about young people in China who find ways around the censors to learn about what happened, who use VPNs to watch videos like this one, who keep the memory alive even though it's dangerous. I think about Hong Kong students in 2014 and 2019 who knew about Tiananmen Square and protested anyway. They knew the risks. They knew how it could end. They did it anyway. That has to count for something, right? The seeds we planted didn't grow into the tree we imagined. But seeds don't disappear. They wait. Sometimes for a very long time. But they wait. If you're a young person in China watching this through a VPN, being careful about your digital footprint, wondering if it's worth the risk to even know about this history, I want to tell you something. Your government has spent enormous resources trying to make you forget or never learn about what happened in 1989. They've scrubbed it from your textbooks. They've banned any mention of it online. They've made the date itself unspeakable. Why? If we were just naive kids who caused a riot, why work so hard to erase us? Because they're afraid. They're afraid of what it means. They're afraid that if you knew your own history, you might start asking the same questions we did. You might start demanding the same things. They're afraid because they know that once people taste the idea of freedom, once they experience the feeling of having a voice, you can't make them forget. You can only make them quiet, but quiet isn't the same as gone. You don't have to risk everything the way we did. You don't have to be a hero. But don't let them make you forget. Don't let them convince you that what happened was necessary or right. Don't let them tell you that economic development is worth giving up every other right. Remember that China is your country, not the party's country. Yours. And you deserve to have a say in how it's run. If you're watching this from somewhere with freedom of speech, I want you to understand how precious that is. I know your democracies feel imperfect. I know you get frustrated with your governments, with politicians who don't listen, with systems that seem broken or corrupt. But you can say that. You can post it online. You can organize protests. You can vote people out. You can access any information you want. Do you understand how incredible that is? Do you understand what some of us were willing to die for? Don't take it for granted. Don't let it slip away because you're too tired or cynical or comfortable to protect it. Because I've lived on both sides. I know what it's like to be 20 years old and believe you can make your country better. And I know what it's like to spend the next 20 years being unable to even talk about it. The distance between those two states is smaller than you think. And the slide from one to the other can happen faster than you'd believe. There's one image from the protests that became famous worldwide. You might have seen it, a man standing in front of a column of tanks the day after the clearing of the square. The tanks try to go around him. He steps in their way. Back and forth, this incredible moment of one unarmed person defying military might. We call him Tank Man. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody knows what happened to him after that moment. But he's become the symbol of Tiananmen Square. And I think about him a lot. Because here's the thing. We were all Tank Man for 7 weeks. Thousands of us standing in front of the party apparatus and saying no further, believing that our bodies and our voices and our moral clarity could stop the tanks. For a while, it worked. For a while, the tanks stopped. But then they didn't. People always remember Tank Man, but they forget that he was facing tanks that had just spent the night rolling over the bodies of people who'd tried to stop them earlier. His courage wasn't in stopping the tanks. It was in knowing they couldn't be stopped and standing in front of them anyway. Maybe that's the real lesson of Tiananmen Square. Not that we succeeded or failed, but that we tried, that when the choice came between safety and speaking up, between survival and standing for something, some people chose to stand. That's worth remembering. That's worth passing on. It's been more than 35 years since I stood in Tiananmen Square believing I was helping to change China's future. More than 35 years since I ran through tear gas and gunfire, since I watched the goddess of democracy fall, since I lost friends to bullets and prisons and silence. Sometimes I dream I'm back there. I'm young again, standing at the monument to the people's heroes, listening to speeches about freedom and democracy. In the dream, I know how it's going to end. I know about the tanks and the deaths and the decades of silence. But I stay anyway. In the dream, I always stay. Because for 7 weeks in 1989, we were alive in a way that's hard to describe. We were part of something bigger than ourselves. We believed that ideas mattered more than guns. We believed that a government that claims to serve the people should actually listen to them. We were wrong about winning, but we weren't wrong about the ideas. Those ideas don't die just because tanks roll over them. Those ideas don't disappear just because governments ban any mention of them. They survive in memories, in stories, in videos like this one, in every young person who learns what happened and decides that their government should be better. My name is Chen Wei. That's not my real name, but it's real enough. I was a student during the Tiananmen Square protests. I was there when we dreamed of a different China. I was there when those dreams ended in blood and smoke. And I'm here now, finally able to tell this story, to add my voice to the historical record that the Chinese government tries so hard to erase. June 4th, 1989. Remember it. Tell others about it. Don't let it become just another deleted entry in a censored history, because we were there, we existed, we mattered. And what we believed in, that people deserve freedom, that governments should serve their citizens, that courage in the face of overwhelming power means something, that still matters too. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering with me. Don't forget us. Please don't forget us. If this video has moved you, if you think this story matters, share it. Use the buttons below. Help this story reach people who need to hear it, especially young people in China who are searching for their own history. Leave a comment with your thoughts. I want to know what this story means to you. I want to build a community of people who refuse to forget. And if you believe in preserving these kinds of stories, if you believe in the importance of remembering what governments want forgotten, subscribe. There are more stories that need to be told, more voices that need to be heard. History isn't just what's written in textbooks. It's what we choose to remember and pass on. Choose to remember.